Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the JPM podcast. Today, we'll be going with our medical ethics series. So this is a topic we've had live and we have discussions about it. We've put out the pamphlet by Rabbi Sprung and the Beis Medresh for Medical Halacha on this topic. And today we're going to go through a little bit of summary of that pamphlet and also an additional few resources that help it make it just a little bit more understandable and practical in your everyday life. So as always, huge thank you to Rabbi Sprung and putting together these pamphlets and the tremendous effort that goes into them. And obviously today I'm joined by Mendel, who puts a ton of effort into revamping these pamphlets just a tad, so that way, we can gain all that much more from the practical applications of these pamphlets. So with that being said, Mendel, why don't you start us off?
All right. So especially with this series, we have other series that are a little bit more halacha l'maisa, that we bring expert poskim to talk about relevant issues within healthcare. But with this ethics podcast, very clearly just for your entertainment only, and none of this is meant to replace professional medical or rabbinic advice. And perhaps it comes with its own moral hazard, if you will.
So the point where this really all starts is what are the components of consent? So I don't know if we actually, we formally introduced the topic, but the topic is minors as living organ donors. So the questions that we're going to come across, the heart of the question is, can a minor give consent? And so to tackle that question, we have to explain, what is consent? So consent has 4 components: voluntariness, capacity, comprehension, and disclosure. So voluntariness is as it sounds, right? We can't force people to make decisions. Capacity is that they have to have decision-making capacity, meaning that just in general, right? You have a child, small children don't have the capacity to make decisions. As they grow older, they do. And the question is, at what point as they're growing can we say this child has decision-making capacity? Comprehension, not just that they're able to make decisions in general, but do they understand the ramifications of the decision they're going to be making right now? So in this particular case, right, there's a lot of health components that they have to be able to understand, risks of what they're doing. And lastly is disclosure, which is relevant medical information regarding the intervention must be discussed with the patient, right? So if we're going to be, talking to the patient has to have comprehension, then, we have to have disclosure, and the patient has to be fully receive the information, not just, obviously to understand it. So the question lies is where in Judaism do we make that line that a minor will have consent? At what point exactly do we go from saying this child does not have consent to this child can give consent to give an organ?
Yeah, and there's various reasons why you'd need consent in a healthcare arena. You're going to need it for ethical reasons, obviously, but also for legal and administrative reasons. What we're going to focus on today is going to be analyzing capacity in Jewish law, capacity for the minor. So capacity is different from comprehension. So comprehension is obviously just if the patient understands what's going on, and you can prove that they have understood the information that you've presented to them. Capacity is a little bit more of their ability to understand the inner subjectivity and make an informed reasoning how this idea relates to them, so they can comprehend the information and then obviously make a decision for their particular situation. And that's what we're going to be exploring. Important to note that there are some ethical problems that may or may not have a semi-clear solution. This is very much not an ethical problem. This is much more of an ethical dilemma. So by the end of this, we're going to present 4 very different positions and models in halacha for how to view this issue. And while we're not going to come out with a great deal of clarity, hopefully this journey will allow for extra tools for people when exploring these ideas for themselves in their own practice.
In terms of nomenclature, is the distinction you're making between dilemma and problem whether or not we come out with a solution?
I found it in one great ethicist that I really like. I don't know how widespread it is within the literature, but I think it's a handy heuristic. It's an ethical problem, especially when we talk about it's going to be something that has a semi-clear consensus around it. An ethical dilemma is just something that very much reasonable minds may differ, even to the scope of how do we even look at this issue? How do we model it?
Okay, so our case is based on a real case. So this was, I think you can find this case in PubMed, right? So we can read it real quickly together. A. Hart was a 7-year-old. She was diagnosed with hemolytic uremic syndrome, causing irreversible acute kidney injury. And she had an identical twin sister who was determined to be a perfect organ match and an ideal donor candidate. The twins were examined by a psychiatrist who testified that the prospective donor gave testimony that she had strong identification with her twin sister. So they asked the twin, they were, how old did we say they were? They were 7 years old. The psychiatrist, testified that she was able to give consent, essentially. And he testified that in his professional estimation, if the surgery was a success, A. Hart's survival would be of immense benefit to the donor, as the quality of her family life would be better off than in the case of great distress and resultant loss of her twin sister. So he added that it was beneficial for the twin to donate because her quality of life would be improved. And let's see, I've been informed. Okay, so due to the grave emotional impact of the situation of the donor and her family, the courts ruled that Eleanor Hart and Peter Hart, the parents and the guardians of the twin girls described under these circumstances, could give their consent to the operations on both children. So at the end of the day, with this case, they allowed the child to donate, and they gave these reasons that she was able to give consent and that her quality of life would improve with her sister around. I do want to point out that this case, as you can see, was in 1972, and just in general, like the way things have been going in the United States, and I think mostly around the world, is that this is a very uncommon practice. We don't generally have children donate organs for many reasons, and a lot of it is just practical reasons. And additionally, in modern medicine, organ donation is not really the first line. We have other things, like especially in this case, right? Dialysis would be much more common practice now. So although we're going to be discussing the practical applications, this is likely not something you're really going to come across in your like everyday practice, but it's still interesting to have this discussion and talk about, the concept of consent, because consent comes across many areas of medicine, not just organ donation.
Yeah. Okay. So just as a quick summary, twin A had hemolytic uremic syndrome and lost function to her kidneys, and twin B was considered a perfect match as they were identical twins. And the question is, with kind of the assessment by the psychiatrist that twin B understood what was being asked of her, did she have the capacity? And according to the psychiatrist, he added another kind of element to the ethical framing, and he said that perhaps it's even in the best interest of twin B to donate a kidney, as it's going to lead to a better outcome for the whole family, of which twin B is obviously a part of. So points to ponder. How does Judaism look at organ donation? Is one required to donate an organ? Is one allowed to donate an organ, or is it somewhere in the middle? Kind of more related to the nature of the minors in our case, we know that everyone has probably had a bar or bas mitzvah that's listening to this, and we were all told that we were adults at that moment. The question is, does Judaism really look at the process of maturation as a dichotomous sort of variable? You are a minor one day and you've reached the age of majority the next day, or is it more of a spectrum? And finally, say that patient B, twin B, wanted to give their kidney. Do we have a right to protect the patient from giving her kidney? So it's kind of like the inverse.
So I'll just say on that one point, because I'd read this packet a few times, and I'm not as well versed, Mendel, as you are. But one thing that always struck me is that, like you said, we grow up knowing that like 12 and 13 are the age of maturity. Like that's kind of the deadline. And I didn't even know that in regards to other areas, we don't always consider that the case. So the background to that question, if you don't have a background, that seems like what do you mean? What's the question, right? At 12 or 13, we consider you an adult. But the real background is because there are other areas in halacha where we don't consider you an adult. So the question is, when it comes to something like this, what do we follow? Do we follow the general consensus that you're an adult at 12 or 13, or do we follow those other areas in halacha where you're not really considered an adult till older?
Yeah, and to phrase it a little bit differently, as we'll see, the primary sources back from the Mishnah and the Gemara, they recognize that there are different things that we expect of people from different ages, from 13 and on. And so when we were all told that we were adults and given our first l'chaim, perhaps irresponsibly, at the age of 13, what were they telling us? In what way were we adults in that moment? Okay, so our first question is organ donation discretionary or obligatory? And where how does Judaism look at this in general? So the short of it is that there's a great Gemara in Sanhedrin. Gemara says, how do you know that if someone is drowning, that you have a responsibility to save them? So we derive it from the pasuk, from the verse, do not stand idly by as the blood of your fellow is being spilled. So this principle, don't stand idly by, the Gemara takes to mean that you're even required to go through additional measures and have some measure of sacrifice, so to speak, to monetarily make sure that that this person can be saved. So from here, we know that there's a moral imperative that you must sacrifice something for, some amount of energy, so to speak, from yourself to save the other, and that we're all bound by.
I'll just say that we, just to self-reference and self-promote, I guess, but more so because it's relevant. That in itself is a very large topic, and we briefly covered it in another video. So if you're not familiar with our other videos, I definitely suggest taking a look at that video, because that's something we're going to come back to pretty often throughout the series, likely.
Yeah, the nature of how much a person needs to give of themselves to help others is very relevant to anyone working in healthcare. And as Moshe said, we've dealt with it in a couple of ways, and it seems like every topic in medical halacha in some way or the other will reference this. So we know that from that Gemara that you have to put some amount of energy. You need to sacrifice something for it, right? In the words of the Gemara, you'd have to hire people, right? And that sounds like a monetary sacrifice. Do you have a responsibility, however, to put yourself at risk, right? To put yourself in bodily risk to save the other, which is much more analogous to our case of giving of your own flesh and blood in giving a solid organ donation. It is worth mentioning that in 1971, when this case was done, kidney donation was much more risky. In our current generation, with advancements both in surgical management and in medical management, it's considered much safer. So, especially when looking at this source, it's an honest question if it applies, and we'll see with the more modern sources how they deal with that. So I brought the Pischei Tshuva from Shulchan Aruch because by looking at this bit of Shulchan Aruch with the Nesei Kelim, with the supporting commentaries, you really can get a much bigger view of the sugya. But they're really quoting a Radbaz. Radbaz lived in the 14th, 15th century, and he was asked. Someone said that the local feudal lord is going to said, I'll kill person A if unless person B allows his arm to be cut off. And the question was person B responsible? Did he have a responsibility, halachic responsibility, to allow his arm to be chopped off to save person A? And the Radbaz posits no. Yeah, the tshuva is long. He gives potentially two answers for it, and that can be explored a little bit further within the packet. Rabbi Sprung's packet. One answer was that he's seen infection even from a small scratch, and therefore this constitutes a real risk to your life. And how do you know that your life is inherently worth less than this other person's life? And why would you give up, so to speak, your health in this moment, which may lead to death, to save this other person's life? And then the next thing he said is a little bit harder to read, and there are different reads of this Radbaz. But the way Rabbi Sprung read it in the packet, as you can see in a couple of the notes that kind of on this tshuva, he says that Rabbah says there's no responsibility to give an aver. That's a little bit harder, and maybe it takes analysis for itself. But Rav Asher Weiss, an individual, a Rav that needs absolutely no introduction, but Gedolei Hapaskim of our generation in current Pesach, he says that he kind of wrestles with this. He says giving of your organ donation, our generation, doesn't represent as tangible a risk as Rebbe Baz is describing, but he says even so, I can say that it might be a very laudable thing to do, but I can't say that there's a clear responsibility and obligation. So in other words, organ donation, while laudable and an incredible act of heroism, is not considered a halachic chiyuv. It's considered so it's not compulsory. A person needs to give consent to have it done, and therefore we're kind of coming back to our matter at hand. Does a minor have the ability and the capacity to make this kind of moral decision for themselves?
So just two small comments. One, for those who don't know who Rav Asher Weiss is, because we do have people of many background, and although he doesn't generally require an introduction, we've had Rav Asher Weiss on. I don't know how many. It was one time, I think, but we consult. Rabbi Sprung brings on his chuvas all the time. He's really one of the most prolific writers of modern medical halacha, and is one of the one of the major postum of today's generation when it comes to medical halacha. So I'll just say that, and that's very much an understatement, but just to, for context, for those who really don't know. And then the second thing is I just want to recap what we said. So we brought down the source that we do have somewhat of an obligation to look out for one another and to save one another. Right. That's where the question really stemmed from, is that there is somewhat of an obligation. And the question is, does that obligation extend to giving one's organ? Meaning, is there really a requirement, the requirement to be accountable for one another? Does that requirement extend to donating an organ? And what we're saying is that it really doesn't, based on the fact that, at least especially in 1970, it would have been a sacrifice. There are risks and complications, and you're not obligated per se to for your fellow's life in that particular sense.
So in a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek sort of way, the question is organ donation halachic imperative or halachic elective? And we would say that it falls into the elective variety.
Okay, got it. That's good. So that said, where does that leave us? That means we can't, it's not obligatory. So we have to get consent, because, right, presumably if it was obligatory, then that's a different story, but it's not obligatory. So where does that leave us? Now that we have to get consent, where does that leave us with kids, and how do they offer their consent?
Yeah, so we're going to explore 4 different halachic models and four different poskim that dealt with this issue. The first is going to be Rabbi Moshe Hirschler. This order is somewhat chronological. Rabbi Moshe Hirschler was one of the chief editors of Encyclopedia Talmudis, was a tremendous Talmud Chacham, had various rabbinic appointments, lived from 1922 to 1991. Rosh Hashanah Auerbach, perhaps one of the definitely in our generation, one of the his gravity in medical halacha is hard to qualify and hard to quantify. He's kind of the very basis, the very basis of medical halacha. Dr. Rabbi Steinberg's encyclopedia is very much built on he's considered himself a Talmud of his. Nishmas Avraham is built on his works. Shri Shabbos Kilchas is built on his works, and his reach is far and wide. Yitzchak Zilberstein, he's a current Paisek, still kind of a contemporary of Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, as you can see by the time he's still with us, and Rabbi Weiss, as we've introduced. So Rabbi Hirschler, how does he model it? So he was asked an analogous question. It's not exactly the same. So he was asked a question about patient A needs a kidney. Patient B is his brother. Now his brother, however, is mentally challenged. He doesn't go into the exact nature of what cognitive issue his brother had, but he said, suffice to say that he's not convinced that or the way it was described to him, that he didn't have capacity. He perhaps didn't have comprehension. And so, how do we deal with, do we allow that brother to give his kidney or not? And what he tries to do is he tries to build a case for and he explores it, and kind of the epilogue of the case is interesting that we'll get to. But the way he explored it was, he said perhaps there's implied consent here. Everyone would want to make sure that their brother would give their kidney. A reasonable person would want to give their kidney. Therefore, we can assume that if this person had more mental capacity, he would make that decision. And therefore, we can imply that that's really what his opinion is. That's really what he would like to do. And therefore, we're going to imply consent in this case, and then perhaps allow it. Perhaps. In the epilogue of the case, he writes how it was found out that this patient also had a sister that was a good match for him. And the sister was of sound body and mind, and decided that she would rather her brother, her other brother, give of his kidney. And he said, you know what? So it turns out that my case wasn't my assumption of applying consent, was not borne out by the reality of this case. So now what would we do in our case? So taking his opinion to our case and transposing into our case, perhaps, perhaps a little bit different. It sounds like the 7-year-old girls, according to the psychiatrist, were able to comprehend the details of the case. And while they didn't have capacity because their self-concept wasn't as developed, being that they didn't reach the age of majority, perhaps that would be enough in his mind, in Ramesh Shosha's mind. Okay. A similar psak was given by Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was asked a much more direct case, and this was about bone marrow transplant. Bone marrow transplant is worth mentioning that even back in the 70s was not risky. It didn't constitute the loss of a functional part of the body, right? Bone marrow grows back. And he was asked, someone of a similar age, would they be allowed to donate their bone marrow to their family member? I think in this case, it was actually one of the parents. And so he models it slightly differently. He says, perhaps we can say it's in the best interest of the child. And this is very similar to the way the court ruled in our case. Perhaps it's in the best interest of the child, as they would want to live in a family that, has all the members of their loved one. And he analogized it to a case of a minor who is being converted to Judaism with his family. And he said that, listen, they're making a choice for the child that comes at a significant burden. But still, we say that overall, it's value added and it's in the best interest of this child. So too here, we can say, listen, it comes with a certain tax, a certain burden, and pain, and suffering, and some modicum of risk. However, perhaps we can say that's in the best interest of the child, and therefore we'd allow it. Now, and he uses the dictum in halacha, zakayin lakatan afil yemechad. In other words, zakayin la'adam shalei b'fanav. You're allowed to benefit someone even if they're not present. They're not present as a stakeholder, as an active stakeholder. Now he questions, and he's uncomfortable with this ruling, and he writes as much, or Dr. Avram Ben Avram writes as much in his Sefer Nishmas Avram. He says maybe we can't use the same legal schema because the language of the dictum is akain le'adam shalei b'fanav. You give to someone who's not present, but you don't give to someone by taking something from them when he's present. So hard to say how he would actually paskin, but he definitely opens the door towards that direction. And in general, I found that people are much more machmir in the way they're writing, and you'd have to really ask cases that have actually happened by people that are around these paskin. It is worth noting that Dr. Jason Reiner, in his chapter on the subject, brings down a Lev Avram, which is a sefer that quotes the psakim of Rosh Zalman Auerbach, and he writes slightly more affirmatively that Rosh Zalman would actually paskin this way, though I haven't seen those primary sources.
So just so we can nail down, because they're very similar but a little bit nuancedly different. The way I understood it,
fundamentally different models.
Right. So the way I understood it was that the way Moshe Hersler modeled it was a matter of, right, it was just like literally as it's written, like implied consent, that we would assume that someone in that situation would want to do this, and therefore we can take that generalized wanting to do it and say you would also want to do it. It's implied that you would want to do it the same way anyone in your situation would want to do it. Whereas I understand Shlomo Zalman as more of we can point to an obvious benefit in this case, and therefore say that you would want this benefit too. Meaning it's much more, and I guess almost like substantial, that we can say this is obviously beneficial for you, and therefore you would possibly, we can possibly do that. We can, in place of you not being able to tell us, we know that you would want this beneficial thing. Seems like we'd have a little bit more to work with.
According to Rav Hirschler, we need to estimate, right? In the Halachic language is umdana, right? So we're estimating what you would want. According to Shlomo Zalman, we're telling you what's in your best interest, right? So a parent makes a decision for their child. There's no way you can't wait, for the child to decide to get their vaccines. And perhaps maybe as an adult they'll be anti-vax. Do you have the right to give them their vaccines? And the answer is, as parents or as active members of society, you do what's in the best interest of the child, right? This best interest is not necessarily a direct correlate with what they would choose, as it was in the previous rationale, right? So yeah, implied consent versus best interest standard, and the differences are interesting. And I think that Rosh Zalman's approach would be stronger, right? Stronger legally, because in Rabbi Moshe Hersler's case, his estimation had a serious question to it. First of all, it was really hard to poll a bunch of reasonable people. People are not in that situation, so even their subjective, kind of poll responses would be questionable. And furthermore, the sister said she wasn't so comfortable giving her organ, right? So that comes with, so the legal mechanism isn't as strong, but here the legal mechanism is much stronger. Okay, Rabbi Yitzchak Zilberstein. So he kind of views it as much more of the question is, what is the dichotomous age of majority? And so he brings the Gemara Nidin, saying that a person pretty much is given moral authority, is given kind of the responsibility to make their moral decision-making process from the age of 13. That's why we're chayiv in mitzvahs. That's why we're responsible to do all the strictures that halacha tells us to do. At that age of 13, we're responsible to fast, and he brings a few other examples. And I brought the actual tshuva that he wrote. I think it was in Halacha Refuah. I'll try to bring all the sources with their makaris. It is worth mentioning that these past two opinions were not directly in the pamphlet. I did try to add more of the paskim, more of the opinions that I saw and really enjoyed while exploring this sugya. All right, so that's kind of how he looks at it. So he looks at it, listen, at 13, you have the ability, like any other chiyuv, to put on tefillin, and so you happen to also have another chiyuv called lo samad al dam re'echa, don't stand idly by. This moral imperative, you have reached the age of 13 or 12, but in the case of women, and now you have the responsibility to make this decision for yourself. And if Torah gave you this responsibility to make this decision for yourself, of course, as we said before, organ donation is not compulsory, it's elective, right? It's not imperative in halacha. So at this age, you would be able to make this decision for yourself. Now, I will say the strength of this approach. Oh, he also says in the negative that before this age, you have no ability to make this decision for yourself, and since it's not halachic imperative, he rejects the best interest standard, and he rejects the implied consent, the umdinen standard as well. Now we get to the opinion of Rav Weiss. Now, in Rav Weiss's opinion, I really think you have a much better view of the development of what it means to be, a gadol, someone who has reached the age of majority in halacha. And he starts this conversation in a fascinating way. So he layers in different legal responsibilities that a person has throughout their life. And the first one he brings is a fascinating case by Kinya Ishio. Ishio was considered a incredible king, and the Torah says that he did tshuva. So he did tshuva. How did he do tshuva? He was supposed to be one of the benevolent kings of Malchus Beis David. He was considered a tzaddik his whole life. And so when he said tshuva, he really returned all the judgments, all the monetary judgments that he made before the age of 18. He returned them at the age of 18 because he viewed himself as not having reached the full ability to understand the legal back and forth and the pros and cons of each case till the age of 18. So, and the Shulchan Aruch paskins like this, that a judge is, even if they know halacha, and even if they're extremely an erudite scholar, until the age of 18, you're unable to really balance the pros and cons of all ideas, and therefore while you may have comprehended them, you don't really have the capacity to make these judgments for yourself. The Bach quotes that as well, and he layers another interesting halachic model, and he says that even within a person's own life, not only making judgments for others as we've explored before, even in a person's own life, to make certain business decisions, halacha doesn't recognize you as being able to make those decisions until the age of 21, namely to deal with an inheritance, a weighty inheritance that your parents have worked hard for. They passed on and they gave you this inheritance till the age of 21. This is specifically land rights, but if you look in the Shulchan Aruch Hadlokum, you'll see the commentaries explore how this relates to other ideas like the rights to business acquisition in certain areas, like the Shach brings, and Rav Weiss in his Tshuva brings a few other examples. And they said until the age of 21, you don't have the ability to really balance it out. You may understand yourself, you may be able to understand the pros and cons, but you haven't lived enough life to really understand your own inner, decision-making process, and thereby give something that you haven't worked for yourself. The exact phraseology of the Shulchan Aruch is that until the age of 20, you are biased towards instant gratification, and past the age of 20, you've had enough instant gratification, hopefully, throughout that time period, or you at least understand what it means to work for a long time for something. And therefore, at that age, 21, the way Rav Asher Paskin, then you'd allowed to make the decision for yourself. Now, taking that from the sphere of business ethics back to our case, Rav Asher says, Paskin similarly, saying that to make this permanent decision, to give of your own organ, something that we often take our health for granted. So you definitely take the organs that you've never seen for granted. You might be biased towards, being a hero or the social gratification here. So he says that if you at the very least need to wait for the age of 20 or 18. And that's the way Reb Sprung explained this case to me, saying that before that age, Rav Asher would not recognize that you have the ability to make the decision for yourself, questioning capacity, and therefore also questioning the ability to give informed consent, thereby making it not permissible.
So a few things. So first off, I want to just spend, if for whoever is watching this video and you have the minute to pause and read this, I definitely suggest reading it. And if not, at least go through the pamphlet, because I think this highlights one of the other opinions we didn't highlight, the background as to why even at 13, when we generally consider you an adult, why we wouldn't consider you adult in this case, and this kind of nicely highlights that. Also, the first two opinions we brought down, of Moshe Hirschler and Shalom Zalman, I think, we can't really extrapolate to what they would say in practice, right? We don't really have much in terms of what they would say in those cases, because we turned out it was, we found the sister, or, and Shalom Zalman, he was just kind of grappling with the issue. He didn't really come out to an actual psak, like we didn't have it in those writings. But these last two opinions are a lot more practical. And so, so just to break it down, what we're left with is pretty much Reb Zilberstein, who would say, at 13, you're an adult is an adult, and it's regardless of, what the case is, at least in regards to health. Meaning, so at 13, you would be able to give consent. But above 13, you would, but below not. Is that correct?
Yeah,
And,
the imam it as any other ethical responsibility that you may have.
and according to Rav Asher, this is one of those times where we would put your knowledge of being an adult at question, and so you would not be able to explicitly give consent at 15. You would have to wait till 20 to just be able to do it on your own. Now, I think am I correct? Did we ask him what he would hold in case of someone who's not 20 yet but above 13? In a case of someone, let's say, who's like 17, I think we did get some sort of.
Right, and to add another layer, what if the parents say, no, we've spoken to him, and what if the care team says we've spoken to them, they really understand everything, and so the way he writes it is a little bit hard to really see the exact wording. So he says, "Achia ben chav lepachas ben yitchas shana loy lekabel." You shouldn't accept it. Ela ba'askamas aviv oyaper trapas, without the acceptance of his parents or a legal guardian. So in correspondence with Rabbi Sprung, who is a Talmud Muvak of Rav Asher and understands Rav Asher's position much better than I do, he says that no, a 17-year-old, according to Rav Asher's thinking, would not be allowed to donate their organ, even if the legal guardians and the parents attest that he understands and that this is a reasonable decision.
Interesting. So that's it's interesting because we've gone through this a few times, and I don't think I've ever realized the gravity of what he's saying, because essentially, in regards to legalities, 18 is really considered an adult by most standards, right? I don't know in terms of organ donation.
He opens the door to 18.
Okay.
And I think that Israeli law, secular law, says 17 is the age for it, right? And but so it's interesting. This may be one of those areas where the current halachic psak. But it is worth mentioning that Rav Zilberstein is still alive, and Rav Asher, they're both very active poskim. So this, again, one of these areas that you're gonna have to talk to the Rav that you trust most,
right,
using as an intelligent consumer, so to speak, of rabbinic advice.
So yeah, I think that's a great point. I think we just it's a matter of just keep in mind that what may seem obvious, an 18-year-old comes to your office and same sort of story, right? There's a twin or something that wants to give an organ, that may be a lot more practical than the case we brought down that happened in 1972, where you had the two 7-year-olds. Just important to keep in mind that not.
But coming back to our case, right? Yeah. So coming back to our case, now that we've gone through all the supporting literature, does Halacha recognize? Does Halacha see organ donation as a responsibility? We said no, right? It sees it as Halacha elective, not an imperative. The impediment of the court was that the child wasn't able to give, consent. How do we view consent in halacha? So we said it really is the matter of machlekes. According to Rabbi Zilberstein, it sounds like it's much more dichotomous. 12 or 13 is when you're able to make these sorts of decisions for yourself, and according to Rav Asher, it's a much more it's a spectrum, and he leans towards the kind of the end of the spectrum, the end of adolescence, to make this decision for yourself. There are other opinions that try to use other legal mechanisms, such as the best interest or implied consent standard, to see if we can kind of add that to our decision making. And that kind of, I hope everyone's enjoyed this sugya as much as we had, and that's kind of where we're holding now.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining, and make sure to check out our other videos if you're interested in more medical ethics.